March 17th, 2023 should have been like any other day for 19-year-old Janicia Nenny Mason, a young woman full of promise, dreams, and a future ahead of her. But that day would become the starting point of a tragic sequence of events that no one could have anticipated, leaving a family in devastation and a community searching for answers. Nene, a recent high school graduate from Bedford, Texas, had big plans for the future. She wanted to become a nail technician, a career that would allow her to express herself creatively while also building a stable life for herself. But on that fateful day, Nene's life would be violently cut short. Her disappearance began as any mother's worst nightmare. One minute, Nene was last seen in a motel in North Dallas, spending time with friends, as she had done many times before. She had planned to return home and get her life together, as she told her mother, Barbara Taylor, before parting ways. But those would be the final words her mother would hear from her. When Nene failed to make it home later that night, concern set in. Her family, knowing something wasn't right, reported her missing. Yet it wasn't until days later, when a disturbing discovery was made under a bridge in Fort Worth, that the full extent of the tragedy would come to light. March 23, 2023, a call was made to the Fort Worth Police Department at approximately 9 a.m. Someone had reported a body under a bridge near the Trinity River, located off Precinct Line Road. The police arrived at the scene and soon identified the body as that of Nene Mason, thanks to her fingerprints. She had been found under a bridge, naked and alone, her body abandoned in an area nearly 27 miles away from where she had last been seen. The sight was haunting. No visible signs of trauma were apparent, but there was something unsettling about the whole situation. How had she gotten here? How had she ended up so far from her last known location? More questions than answers were left hanging in the air. Barbara Taylor, Nene's mother, was left to piece together the clues of her daughter's final hours. She would soon learn that Nene had been with friends at the motel and that she had gotten into a red car that night. But who was behind the wheel? Why did Nene get into that car? These were questions that no one seemed able to answer. The investigation quickly turned to Joseph Aparicio, a 31-year-old man who, despite no clear connection to Nene at the time, was eventually charged with her murder. Evidence would later emerge that linked Aparicio to the crime: surveillance footage, cell phone data, and even physical evidence like bloodstains in Nene's clothing found in his bedroom. But the full details of that night and the motive behind the murder remained a mystery for months. Nene's family was left in limbo, struggling to understand how a young woman with so much potential ended up dead under a bridge. As the investigation continued, it became clear that this was no random act. Nene had not simply gotten into the wrong car by accident. There was something more to the story, something that led to her tragic death, yet to be fully explained. This is the chilling story of Janicia Nenny Mason, a case that has not only left her family grieving, but also left an entire community questioning the safety of their own loved ones. What happened that night in North Dallas? Who can truly be trusted? And why was Nene's life taken so soon? Tonight, we unravel the story of a young woman's tragic end and the search for answers that continues to haunt her loved ones. Janicia Mason, or Nene as everyone called her, was a young woman filled with hope, ambition, and dreams for the future. Born and raised in Bedford, Texas, she was known for her infectious personality, her warmth, and her determination. At just 19 years old, Nene had already shown signs of the kind of person she wanted to be: an individual who cared deeply about others, someone who had a love for life, and who had the world at her feet. She was a 2022 graduate of Trinity High School, where she was described by those who knew her as bright and full of energy. Nene was the type of person who lit up a room with her laughter. She had an undeniable spirit that made her not just a friend to many, but a daughter, sister, and someone everyone could rely on. To her family, she was everything. Her mother, Barbara Taylor, often spoke of how much Nene meant to her. She was her pride and joy, the person she had watched grow up, and the person she hoped would go on to achieve great things in life. Nene had big plans. She wanted to become a nail technician, something she had always dreamed of. She was fascinated by the art of nails and saw it as a way to not only express herself creatively, but also as a way to build a future for herself. Like many young people just starting out, Nenny was in the process of figuring out who she was and what her future would hold. But that future would be stolen from her in the blink of an eye. In the days before her disappearance, Nen had told her mother that she was going to get her life together. After spending time with friends, she had told Barbara that she planned to return home, settle down, and begin the next chapter of her life. But no one could have imagined that those plans would be abruptly cut short. What could have been a new start, a fresh chapter in Nene's life, turned into a nightmare. Her mother, Barbara, recalls the last time she heard from Nene. It was March 17th, 2023. Nene had called her that afternoon, telling her she would be home soon. Those were the last words Barbara would ever hear her daughter say. She would never hear her voice again. Nene had spent time at a motel in North Dallas with friends, an innocent gathering or so it seemed. She had been with some familiar faces, and nothing seemed amiss. But somewhere along the way, Nene made a decision that would lead to her tragic end. She got into a red car with someone whose identity would become the focal point of an investigation that would soon unfold. Nene's family was left in shock and disbelief. They could hardly comprehend the sudden disappearance. This wasn't like her. Nene was not the type of person to vanish without a word, especially not after making plans to return home. Her mother knew something was terribly wrong, but the answers they sought would not come easily. Instead of a simple explanation or an innocent explanation, what would follow would be a discovery so haunting that it would leave the Mason family and the community with more questions than answers. Nene's death did not just end her young life. It shattered a family, left a community reeling, and ignited a quest for justice that would take months to unfold. But behind this grief and unanswered questions was something more. The untold truth behind that final decision she made when she entered the wrong car. Barbara Taylor, her mother, was left to wonder, how could a simple plan to get her life together end so tragically? How did her daughter go from spending time with friends in a motel to being found dead under a bridge, miles away from where she was last seen? The answers to these questions were not coming quickly, but the investigation into her daughter's death was just beginning. She was last seen at the motel, but from that point onward, things get murky. What happened in the time between Nina getting into that red car and being discovered days later under a bridge in Fort Worth remains unclear. A key element to this mystery is that Nen was reportedly with a woman at the motel. This woman, who was believed to have been with Nene that night, has remained silent throughout the investigation. Nene's mother, Barbara Taylor, has urged her daughter's friend to come forward, hoping for any shred of information that could explain what happened after Nene left the motel. Why hasn't this woman spoken up? Was she a witness to what transpired? Could she provide vital details that might help authorities piece together the puzzle? The investigation into Nene's disappearance would reveal that, despite the efforts of law enforcement to speak with witnesses and gather clues, many people who were with Nene that night remained tight-lipped, refusing to provide names or helpful information. The lack of cooperation from those who were closest to Nene during her final hours has only made the search for answers more challenging. What we do know is this: Nene vanished without a trace that evening. There were no further phone calls, no texts, no messages to her family. She simply disappeared. As hours passed and the investigation continued, Barbara Taylor, Nene's mother, was left in an unimaginable state of confusion and worry. Where was her daughter? What could have happened to her after she left the motel? Nina was supposed to come home, but as the night turned into morning and the days passed without any word from her, a mother's worst fear began to settle in. The search for Nene Mason stretched on for days. Each hour that passed without a trace of her only deepened the anguish for her family. Her mother, Barbara Taylor, refused to give up hope, clinging to the belief that Nene would come home safely. But at the same time, Barbara couldn't ignore the growing fear that something had happened to her daughter, something that was beyond their control. She knew her daughter was not the type to simply vanish, especially without any word or explanation. As the hours turned into days, Barbara's anxiety began to mount. On March 19th, just 2 days after Nene's disappearance, her mother reported her missing to the authorities. But even then, Barbara remained hopeful. She trusted that the authorities would find her daughter and bring her home. She told herself that Nen might have simply gone off with friends or perhaps was just temporarily out of contact. Still, deep down, Barbara knew something wasn't right. With each passing day, however, the reality of the situation began to sink in. It had been nearly a week since Nenny was last seen, and still, there were no leads, no signs, no calls. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. For Barbara, this feeling of uncertainty was suffocating. Her heart ached as she wondered where her daughter could be, what could have happened to her, and why no one seemed to know anything. Then came the call that no mother should ever receive. On March 23rd, 6 long days after Nene disappeared, the phone rang. Barbara would later recall that the voice on the other end was one of the last she ever expected to hear. A Fort Worth police officer had discovered Nene's body under a bridge near the Trinity River. The officer confirmed the grim news. Her daughter had been found. At first, the news that Nene's body had been located should have offered some sense of relief to Barbara. After all, at least now she knew her daughter was no longer missing. But the reality was far more unsettling. The circumstances surrounding Nene's death were shrouded in mystery. The body was discovered under a bridge, about 27 miles away from where Nene was last seen in North Dallas. There were no visible signs of trauma on her body, no outward injuries to indicate how she had died or what had happened to her. There was no blood at the scene, no indication of a struggle, nothing that could provide any clear answers. For Barbara, this only raised more questions. Why would Nene have been taken so far from where she was last seen? How had she ended up under that bridge? And why were there no visible signs of any kind of violent encounter? Was this a crime of opportunity or something planned and calculated? These questions haunted Barbara as she tried to piece together the fragments of information she had. What made this all the more frustrating was that Nene's body seemed to tell a story that the police couldn't yet fully understand. Nene was discovered naked. Her clothes were nowhere to be found. That detail in particular struck Barbara with confusion and fear. What could have caused Nene to be left in such a vulnerable state, abandoned, with no regard for her dignity? As investigators began to gather evidence, the answers they were hoping to find were nowhere to be found either. The lack of visible trauma left the cause of death a mystery. Police had to wait for an autopsy to be completed in order to determine the exact cause of Nene's death. And this prolonged uncertainty only intensified the grief and anxiety Barbara was already experiencing. Every moment felt like an eternity. Every question felt like a weight she couldn't shake. Still, Barbara had to hold on. She couldn't afford to lose hope, even as the mystery surrounding Nene's death deepened. Her heart ached with the thought that her daughter had suffered in some way she couldn't yet understand. But there was one thing Barbara was sure of. Her daughter had not deserved this. She had been taken far too soon, and the family deserved answers, justice, and closure. The pain of not knowing the full truth was a heavy burden on Barbara. She wanted answers. She wanted to understand. But what made matters worse was the silence from those who had been with Nene in the hours leading up to her disappearance. They had been the last ones to see her, and yet no one was coming forward with any helpful information. Barbara's calls for the truth were amplified by the haunting silence of those around her. As a mother, she could never stop fighting for the truth about what had happened to her daughter. She would not rest until she knew who had taken Nene from her and why. In the weeks that followed, Barbara would work tirelessly with law enforcement to piece together what had happened to Nene. But the grief of losing her daughter was a constant presence. It weighed on her heart every day as she moved from one question to the next, desperate for any clue that could bring her closer to the answers she sought. Barbara Taylor's grief was undeniable, but it was clear she had no intention of backing down. As the investigation unfolded, she leaned on her faith in the strength of her family to continue pressing for answers. While the pain was immense, she refused to let it define her quest for justice for Nene. The heartbreak of losing a child is unimaginable for any parent, but the unknowns in Nene's case only made it harder for Barbara to heal. In her own words, she said, "Please, if you find it in your heart, in your soul, in your spirit, please let me know something to give me some kind of peace." These words resonated with anyone who heard them. No mother should ever have to endure this level of uncertainty and pain. Yet despite the overwhelming grief, Barbara's resolve never faltered. She would fight for Nene's memory, no matter how long it took or how difficult the path ahead might be. The investigation took a pivotal turn when bloodstains were found near the scene. This led authorities to believe that the event that resulted in Nene's death was far more complicated than originally thought. Something had occurred before she was abandoned, but the details remained unclear. As detectives sifted through evidence, a disturbing connection emerged between the scene and 31-year-old Joseph Aparicio. His ties to the case were not immediately clear, but what investigators uncovered pointed directly to him as a central figure. They discovered bloodstains and pieces of clothing belonging to Nene in his Haltom City residence. The significance of these findings quickly became apparent. At first, Aparicio had no direct link to Nene's disappearance, but as the investigation progressed, more evidence began to surface, revealing his involvement. Cell phone records, witness testimonies, and the findings at his home painted a picture of a disturbing sequence of events that led to Nene's tragic death. Authorities pieced together that Aparicio had a connection to Nene, though the full extent of their relationship was still being investigated. Surveillance footage captured his presence in key locations, and the mounting evidence suggested that his involvement was no accident. Days after Nene's body was discovered, Joseph Aparicio was arrested. The evidence against him had become overwhelming. Still, even with his arrest, critical questions remained. Why had he targeted Nene? Had they known each other? What had transpired in the hours leading up to her death? The investigation was far from over, and authorities were still trying to understand the full scope of the crime. Barbara Taylor speaking with reporters, her expression solemn. Barbara Taylor, Nene's mother, continued to press for answers. As the case unfolded, she was confronted not only with the devastating loss of her daughter, but also with the unnerving details emerging about the final moments of Nene's life. She wanted to know the truth. Who had done this to her daughter, and why? Despite the pain and confusion, Barbara refused to give up on her pursuit of justice. She held on to the belief that every piece of the puzzle, no matter how small, would eventually come together, bringing her the closure she so desperately needed. The months following Nene Mason's death took an unexpected and chilling turn. Evidence continued to mount against Joseph Aparicio, leading to his arrest and charge for her murder. The details of his involvement slowly came to light, revealing a harrowing and complex story. Aparicio's arrest was the result of a thorough investigation that connected him to Nene's disappearance. Surveillance footage and cell phone records placed him in the vicinity of Nene the night she vanished, raising grave questions about his involvement. As authorities took Joseph Aparicio into custody, the case seemed overwhelmingly strong. But for Nene's family, the emotional toll was only beginning. The trial that followed was painful for Nene's family, particularly her mother, Barbara Taylor. Confronting the man who allegedly caused her daughter's death, Barbara knew that no verdict could return her beloved Nene. Despite the overwhelming grief, Barbara remained steadfast. Her desire for justice never wavered, even as the trial took her through unbearable emotional moments. Barbara's voice trembled as she addressed Joseph Aparicio. Through her tears, she made it clear. Nene wasn't just a victim. She was a cherished daughter, a sister, a friend. Each word echoed with the weight of a mother's heartbreak. Throughout the trial, Nene's loved ones were unwavering in their support for Barbara. Yet despite their unity, nothing could bring Nene back. The trial culminated with Joseph Aparicio pleading guilty and receiving a life sentence. Justice had been served, but it was clear that no verdict would ever fill the void left by Nene's loss. As Barbara Taylor walked from the courthouse, emotions flooded her. Justice had been served, but her grief remained. Her journey was far from over, but she found solace in the love and support of those around her. Nene Mason's life was tragically cut short, but her spirit remains. In the hearts of those who loved her, her legacy will endure, forever imprinted in the memories they hold dear. As the trial of Joseph Aparicio concluded and the sentencing delivered, the cold reality of Janicia, Nene Mason's death, hung over the community and especially over her family. Aparicio's life sentence seemed to offer a form of closure, but no verdict, no matter how final, could erase the trauma Nene's family endured. After all, the burning question remained: how did a bright young woman, just 19 years old, end up dead, naked, and abandoned under a bridge in Fort Worth? How did a single moment of trust in the wrong person A wrong decision made in the haze of a night out lead to such a tragic end. In the wake of Nen's tragic passing, her family and friends gathered together to honor her memory and celebrate the life she should have had. The balloon release, held at Trinity High School where Nen had graduated just the year before, was an emotional tribute to the young woman with so much potential. As each balloon drifted up into the sky, it carried with it the hopes, dreams, and love of those who had known Nini, the same dreams that had been extinguished too soon. At the memorial, Barbara Taylor stood before friends, family, and community members, grieving the loss of her daughter, but also reflecting on Nini's vibrant spirit. Her plea for answers, for closure, remained as loud as ever. Barbara continued to search for understanding, asking herself how someone who had been so loved, so full of life, could be taken in such a cruel and senseless way. But more than the questions, there was the raw, constant ache of loss that no trial or verdict could ever mend. Though the memorial in Texas allowed Nini's loved ones to come together and honor her spirit, the final farewell took place in Shreveport, Louisiana, where Nene's family had deep roots. It was here that they would lay her to rest, surrounded by the people who loved her and would continue to carry her memory. The funeral, a somber and intimate occasion, was a testament to the incredible impact Nene had on the lives of those around her. Her loss was felt not only in Bedford-Euless, Texas, but also in the community of Shreveport, where her family would forever mourn the absence of their bright, beautiful girl. Barbara Taylor's grief was palpable, but so too was her resilience. Through the pain of losing Nene, she had learned to lean on those around her, on family, and on faith. Yet even as she stood by the graveside in Shreveport, surrounded by those who loved Nini, Barbara's fight for answers was far from over. She had lost her daughter, but she refused to lose her voice in the fight for justice and truth. Barbara's voice, though softened by sorrow, was never silenced. In the days and weeks following Nene's funeral, she continued to speak out, calling for anyone with information to come forward. She had not just lost her daughter, she had lost the opportunity to see Nene flourish, to see her accomplish the dreams she had worked so hard for, and that was something no mother should have to endure. Through every interview, through every heartfelt plea, Barbara Taylor's strength became a symbol of hope for those who had been following Nene's story from the beginning. Her pain was evident, but so was her unwavering belief in the importance of justice. She could not, and would not, forget her daughter. And as the days passed, the community around her rallied in support, making sure Nene's name was never lost in the shadows of the tragedy. The pain of losing a child is something that no one should ever experience. It's a loss that reverberates through every corner of a family's life, every relationship, and every future. But in the wake of Nene's death, her family and community showed remarkable resilience. Through the memorials, the funeral, and the ongoing pursuit of justice, they reminded the world that Nin's story didn't end under that bridge in Fort Worth. Her memory, her impact, her love, those would live on forever. As the community continues to mourn, Nen's story serves as a tragic reminder of the fragility of life and the unpredictable course it can take. But it also reminds us of the strength of a family that refuses to be broken. Barbara Taylor will continue to fight for the memory of her daughter and for all those whose lives were touched by Nene's warmth, spirit, and joy. Though her life was taken far too soon, Nene Mason's story is one of love, hope, and the unwavering fight for justice. A mother's love will always remain, even when the world feels impossibly dark. And for Nene, her legacy will live on in the hearts of those who loved her. Despite the conviction of Joseph Aparicio, lingering questions continue to cast a shadow over the case of Genesia Nene Mason. The circumstances surrounding her decision to enter Aparicio's vehicle remain unclear. Was it a case of mistaken identity, or did she know him? The timeline between her disappearance and the discovery of her body under the bridge in Fort Worth raises further concerns. What transpired during those days? These unanswered questions leave a haunting uncertainty for Nene's family and the community. Investigators pieced together surveillance footage and cell phone data, placing Nene in various locations across Dallas. However, the exact sequence of events remains a mystery. The absence of clear evidence detailing her movements during the critical period between her disappearance and the discovery of her body leaves many questions unanswered. While Joseph Aparicio's conviction provides a semblance of justice, the lingering questions about his motives and the events leading up to Nene's death remain. The lack of a clear motive and the absence of a definitive account of the events that transpired during the days she was missing contribute to the ongoing uncertainty. The community continues to mourn Nene's loss, holding vigils and memorials to honor her memory. Yet the unresolved questions about her death cast a long shadow, leaving a sense of incompleteness and a desire for the full truth to emerge. Despite the conviction, the unanswered questions about Nene's death persist, leaving a community and a family yearning for the full truth. The hope remains that, in time, the remaining mysteries will be unraveled, providing the closure that Nene's loved ones so desperately seek. Barbara's search for answers never wavered. She endured unimaginable pain as investigators pieced together the mystery, culminating in the discovery of Nene's body under a bridge far from where she was last seen. The gruesome scene painted a chilling picture, yet it raised more questions than it answered. The lack of clarity surrounding Nene's last moments continues to haunt her loved ones. Though justice was served with the conviction of Joseph Aparicio, the true reasons behind Nene's death remain unclear. For Barbara and those who loved Nene, closure is still elusive. The pain of losing her is compounded by the unknowns that continue to shadow the case. Janessia Nene. Mason's legacy is one of love, hope, and unrealized potential. Her family, friends, and community are left to cherish her memory, but the journey toward full understanding remains unfinished. Despite the tragic end, the love Nene gave and the dreams she held on to will never be forgotten. Nene's story is far from over. Her family continues to hold out hope that one day the full truth will emerge. The fight for justice and closure remains as the search for the missing pieces of this heartbreaking puzzle continues. We remember Nene as the young woman she was, full of promise, full of life, and deeply loved. Though her family may never find complete peace, they will forever honor her memory, keeping her spirit alive in their hearts.